I know I sound like a broken record here, but humor me for a second and imagine you've been warped back to the past. Any era works, really. Just make sure you pick a time when the world was crawling with prehistoric beasts. Alright, scene set? Now, I want you to visualize the absolute worst nightmare fuel you could possibly run into back then. You got it? Now, obviously, I don't have a crystal ball to see exactly which creature popped into your head, but I'd bet good money you pictured something massive, an absolute unit compared to a human. That's usually the main draw of prehistory, right? It's the home of these titanic monsters that feel almost mythical, yet they were 100% real. But here's the thing, because we're so obsessed with the giants, the smaller extinct horrors tend to fly under the radar. I mean, be honest, can you name a prehistoric snake other than Titanoboa or Vasuki? How about a shark besides the Megalodon? Or a canine that isn't a dire wolf? Exactly. Though, if you're a regular on this channel, I'd hope you could actually answer yes to those. Anyway, that's beside the point. The real takeaway is that we are wired to think scary equals big. But ironically, in the real world, it's often the pint-sized critters that cause the most chaos. Look at the stats. When people rank their biggest fears, small things like venomous snakes and spiders usually top the charts. In fact, spiders frequently take the #1 spot in those studies. And keep in mind, the largest spider on Earth right now maxes out at the size of a dinner plate. So, not exactly a giant. I say only because, while a plate-sized spider is definitely unsettling, it proves that something small can be more terrifying to us than, say, an elephant. This got me wondering. We always hear about the giant nightmares of the past, but what about the little ones? So, I went down a research rabbit hole to find out exactly which pocket-sized horrors used to roam the Earth. And let me tell you, some of the stuff I dug up was pretty gnarly. The thing is, they were all nasty for completely different reasons. Some were visually hideous, others packed a punch way above their weight class, and a few were a terrifying mix of both. I think the perfect place to kick this off is a country that's already famous for its fair share of creepy crawlies. You guessed it, Australia. The land of nope, as I like to call it, is still full of questionable wildlife today. But, mixed in with the deadly stuff, there are plenty of animals that people actually find cute. You know, the ones we don't instinctively fear, things like koalas, wombats, and of course, the kangaroo. It's the national icon, and they actually outnumber humans down there, with a population hovering around 50 million. That might not sound so bad since they're just grass eaters and generally pretty chill, but imagine 50 million of them wanting to kill you. Well, maybe not 50 million, but thanks to a genus known as Time's Ekaltadeta asterisk, that nightmare scenario isn't as far-fetched as it sounds. This fascinating little guy lived in Australia from the late Oligocene all the way through to the Miocene period. To be fair, calling Time's Ekaltadeta Time's a kangaroo is a bit of a stretch. It was actually a close cousin belonging to the same superfamily. It fell under a more specific group called the Hypsoprymnodontidae, a family of marsupials that's still around today. However, it's only represented by one living genus, the musky rat kangaroo. It's not related to rats, but it looks a bit like one, hence the creative name. Asterisk, Ekaltadeta asterisk, on the other hand, looked way more like a kangaroo than a rat. It stood upright, but had this low, menacing crouch, almost like it was constantly up to no good. And spoiler alert, it was. Despite weighing no more than a pug, this thing was feisty. It wasn't a leaf lover, it was out for blood. At least, that's the leading theory. See, inside Time's Ekaltadeta asterisk skull were highly specialized teeth that looked like they evolved specifically to shear through flesh with a powerful bite. Not only that, but the jaw structure suggests it was built to process huge amounts of meat, not just scavenge a few scraps. That was the first clue that we were dealing with a carnivorous kangaroo. But maybe it was just a scavenger? We can hope. Unfortunately, probably not. If you look right next to those meat-slicing chompers, you'd find the mother of all premolars. Basically, these things sported massive, oversized teeth that jutted out of their mouths and were sharpened to a point, looking exactly like, well, a spear. And do you want to take a wild guess at how paleontologists think they actually use those teeth? You nailed it, just like a spear. Experts believe the Ekaltadeta would basically shank its prey to death and stab anything else that got too close. So, honestly, it would fit right in on the streets of London. I'm mostly joking. But seriously, that is one marsupial I would steer clear of, even if it was relatively small. And let's be real, if I ran into a pack of these things, being bigger than them wouldn't make me feel safe at all. The only good news in this whole scenario, aside from their small size, is that these marsupials seem to have had a limited stomping ground. Their fossils are only found in northern Queensland, where they likely hunted snakes, birds, rodents, monotremes, and even other marsupials. It's not a pretty picture, but compared to some other ancient nightmares, the Ekaltadeta is actually kind of cute. Seriously, it's downright easy on the eyes when you look at what else was out there. Take the conodonts, for example. Yeah, yikes. You're probably asking, what in the world is a conodont? The answer is an unnervingly common fossil. It's not a specific genus, but rather the name for the fossilized jaws of predatory polychaete annelids. In plain English, segmented worms. We actually still have creatures like this today, such as the bobbit worm. One look at those guys explains exactly why I call conodonts little nightmares. Animals like the bobbit worm don't just look the part, they live it. They pull off some truly diabolical moves, burrowing down and hiding their entire bodies in soft sediment. Then, they stick out their antennae to sense passing victims. This lets them stage a masterclass ambush, using razor-sharp mandibles to snap up some unlucky sucker before dragging them down into the dark. And the whole thing happens in a split second. Let's just say you really don't want to know what happens inside those burrows. It is not pretty. So, knowing how terrifying modern bobbit worms are, just imagine how ghoulish the prehistoric versions must have been. While these worms are still around today, the prehistoric situation was way worse, because conodonts were far more common back then. Basically, the further back in time you go, the more powerful these things become. Their dominance just grows and grows. Of all the geological eras, there was one specific time when these carnivorous noodles were everywhere. The Ordovician period, between 486 and 443 million years ago. During this time, most of the world was underwater. Marine segmented worms were as common as houseflies are today. You'd be hard-pressed to go for a swim
Emerging
without
from
bumping
the
into
sand,
one.
the
Since we
predator
first started
senses its
digging,
prey.
thousands of
Its jaws
conodonts
snap
from this
shut
era
in a
have been
swift
identified
ambush,
worldwide.
but the target
It proves that the worms of the Ordovician were not only strong, but existed in absolutely untold numbers. They didn't just peak in quantity, either. They reached their highest levels of diversity in history, producing not just one type, but a whole buffet of ugly mugs to look at. You are welcome. That said, because their jaws preserve so much better than their soft bodies, it's hard to say exactly what they looked like. We just know their mouths came in many shapes. And not just different shapes, different sizes too. The vast majority were tiny, no bigger than 2 millimeters. But a few, while not exactly massive, were pretty dang big by comparison. Based on the jaws we found, the largest of these predatory worms would have been about 2 meters long. That's over 6 feet 7 inches, weighing around half a kilo. So, maybe not big enough to hunt a human, but definitely big enough to invade your dreams. Or rather, your nightmares. At the same time, there was another unrelated group of small animals that I would also classify as prehistoric terrors. In some ways, they were a bit like the segmented worms. I'm talking about conodonts. If you've been following my content, you know I have a soft spot for these jawless marine vertebrates. They were once ocean staples and are basically prehistoric lampreys. However, I'd argue this group was even more unsettling than the lampreys we have today. Why, you ask? Well, let's start with the fact that their teeth were far sharper, sometimes protruding from their mouths like some sort of grotesque mutation. And when I say sharper, I mean times sharper asterisk. Much sharper. Conodonts are considered to have had the sharpest teeth of any animal ever known. Some species had tooth-like structures 300 times sharper than a human tooth, 25 times sharper than a butcher's knife, and 120th, we are talking about a width comparable to a single strand of human hair, suggesting these creatures could slice through fresh meat with zero effort. It turns out these predators weren't picky eaters,
although
boasting a wide variety of diets,
0.5
hunting styles that were suspiciously similar to modern lampreys,
helps
effectively
contextualize
drilling into the bodies of other sea creatures, but equipped with the sharpest teeth nature has ever produced. So, definitely fascinating, but also absolute nightmare fuel for any hypothetical time-traveling divers. These aquatic terrors could reach lengths of 1 meter, or about 3.3 feet, and they survived for an incredibly long run. First popping up in the Cambrian explosion 500 million years ago and hanging on until the Jurassic. That is a tenure of roughly 300 million years. Oh, and did I mention scientists found evidence that some of them were venomous? Yeah. That is definitely one species we should keep in the history books and out of our oceans. On the bright side, looking at monsters like the conodonts makes you almost appreciate that we only have to deal with lampreys today, because the alternative was horrifying. The same logic applies to insects. I know most of us aren't exactly thrilled when a bug lands on us. Plenty of people freak out, but once you see what was crawling around in prehistoric times, you will be grateful for the bugs we have now. The modern ant is the perfect example of this. Sure, they can be pests. Some species pack one of the most agonizing stings on the planet, but you would happily hug them if you met the extinct Titanoboa. And spoiler alert, the name Titan isn't there because it was cute and cuddly. This creature brings us to what I call the tiny-huge paradox, which occurs when an animal we think of as microscopic suddenly shows up in a size that shatters our understanding of reality. You can see this clearly with Titanoboa, which currently holds the title for the largest ant to ever walk the Earth, roaming across Germany, the United States, and Canada during the Eocene epoch. This supposedly small insect grew to the size of a hummingbird, and just like a hummingbird, it had wings. That is right, the biggest ant in history could fly, boasting a wingspan stretching over 6 inches or 15 centimeters. Just picture a swarm of ants the size of birds diving at you. Now, to be fair, it seems only the queens had wings, so there is a silver lining, but honestly, it is barely comforting, because while a normal ant bite is annoying, it is usually manageable. Now imagine the pain of being crushed by mandibles the size of an entire modern ant's body. To make matters worse, there is a heated debate about their diet, and the leading theory is terrifying. Originally, scientists hoped these giants were just leaf cutters, using those jaws to slice up vegetation, but newer research suggests they are actually related to modern African driver, ants, a species of army ant, famous for marching in colonies 20 million strong and considered a legitimate danger to humans, specifically those unable to run away, like infants or the disabled. And let's state the obvious here. Those modern driver ants are microscopic compared to Titanoboa, which likely marched in similar massive armies, stripping large animals down to white bone before moving on. So, the next time you see a tiny ant in your computer down, backyard, or near your lunch, maybe don't squash it immediately, just be glad it is small. Honestly, a lot of insects fit this bigger was badder theme, with prehistoric dragonflies being the poster children. While technically not true dragonflies, we had their giant cousins, the Megapiranha, swarming the swamps from the Carboniferous period all the way to the late Permian. But like I said, everyone talks about the giant dragonflies. Most people have seen them in a textbook or a dinosaur documentary at least once. But trust me, the fossil record is hiding plenty of other horrors you have likely never heard of. A prime example is the rethink. Now, hearing that name, you probably assume it means cockroaches on steroids. And honestly, that is a pretty solid guess, even if it is technically not the scientific definition. While this extinct group looked remarkably similar to modern roaches, they were a distinct lineage. They are widely considered the ancestors that eventually split into modern cockroaches, termites, and mantises. However, if one skittered across your floor, you would absolutely mistake it for a cockroach. They first showed up in the fossil records way back in the late Carboniferous, behaving pretty much exactly like modern cockroaches, scavenging whatever dead plants and animal junk they could find. But things got a little more intense compared to today's roaches when it came to making babies. You see, modern cockroaches use oothecae to carry their young, which are basically little protective sacs holding the insect's eggs. The ancient roachoids, however, wanted nothing to do with that method. Instead, they rocked long ovipositors, tube-like organs used to inject their tiny offspring directly into various surfaces and food sources, kind of like maggots do. That means we're talking about a world where you'd never know if a rotting log, a piece of meat, or literally anything else was secretly hosting a massive roach infestation inside it. And the other thing that made this group particularly unsettling was, once again, the massive size issue. On average, these guys were absolute units, with multiple species matching or even exceeding the size of the biggest. Roach genus alive today, the Megalodon from Central and South America, which is roughly the size of your entire palm. I shudder to imagine swarms of these giants roaming around, injecting eggs into everything like a facehugger, only for the babies to burst out later like something from a sci-fi horror movie. Plus, just like the Megalodon, most of them didn't just walk, they had wings and were strong flyers. So, yeah, I'll let you picture that nightmare scenario. Moving slightly over on the family tree, there's another relative of the roachoids that I am extremely grateful is extinct. That would be the manipulator, which, surprisingly, isn't named that because it played mind games with my emotions. Nope. This guy dates back to the Cretaceous period, about 100 million years ago, and looked like a horrifying mashup of a cockroach and a praying mantis. The funny thing is, even though it looked way less like a roach than the roachoids did, the manipulator was actually a legitimate cockroach. And I don't mean that as an insult, it was the real deal, just built completely differently from anything alive today. It had long legs, an elongated neck, razor-sharp mandibles, and to top it all off, a super flexible head that could rotate freely. So, what does that actually imply when you put all those features together? It means the Cretaceous period had a predatory cockroach problem. Yeah, you heard that right, a roach that actually hunted things down. I don't know about you, but I think cockroaches are scary enough when they're just running away, let alone chasing you. Thankfully, these hunters were a bit smaller than the rochoids, clocking in at just under an inch, or 2 centimeters long. To be honest though, that's still not comforting, because it proves that predatory cockroaches are technically possible in the grand scheme of evolution. Not cool. And you know what else isn't a comforting thought? Piranhas. You know the type carnivorous fish that hunt in packs, sport wicked sharp teeth, and can strip a carcass to the bone in seconds. They're voracious enough to spawn their own horror franchise, Piranha 3D. Yet no living piranha, no matter how scary, holds a candle to one specific genus that is thankfully long gone, the Megapiranha. 9 million years ago. In the fresh tropical waterways of prehistoric Argentina, this fish reigned supreme as a serrasalmid like no other. On paper, it shared the standard features you see in modern piranhas, like the general body build and a fairly generic piranha look. But its body size? That was a completely different story. Not to beat a dead horse, but this is another case where an animal usually known for being small was just a little too massive for comfort. And by a little, I mean a lot. Obviously, even today, piranhas can inflict serious damage relative to their size, thanks to those razor teeth and mob tactics. There are recorded cases of people losing fingers, toes, and in extreme scenarios, even dying after a swarm attack. And remember, that destruction comes from fish that are typically no bigger than your hand. So, imagine the carnage when you look at the Megapiranha, a beast, where your entire hand could literally fit inside its mouth. Mature individuals measured nearly 30 inches long, or 2.5 feet. That makes them the longest known predatory serrasalmids and by far the heaviest, weighing in at 22 pounds, or roughly 10 kilos. So yeah, this creature was objectively terrifying because it had every trait that makes modern piranhas scary, but dialed up to 11. Take their teeth, for example. They weren't just sharp and big, they were ridiculously powerful. Backed by a super efficient jaw, they could bite with a force of nearly 3,000 newtons. That is stronger than the bite of a full-grown tiger, despite the fish being 30 times smaller. Looking closely at the shape of those chompers, it is clear they packed a serious punch. A study replicating these teeth revealed that the Megapiranha was an absolute powerhouse. We are talking about enough force to smash through a cow's thigh bone, crunch turtle shells, and shatter catfish armor in a single bite. Basically, this guy was hunting big game, if you catch my drift. And here is the kicker. Those teeth were engineered to inflict maximum agony. The design ensured that no matter what it bit, the victim was in for a world of hurt. On soft targets, the pressure focused right at the tips, slicing through meat like a hot knife through butter. But if it hit something hard like bone or armor, the physics changed completely. The force would distribute across the base of the tooth, allowing it to crush down and grind right through the skeleton.
To put that in
Definitely
perspective,
not a peaceful way
the
to meet
modern
your end.
black piranha,
This fish
the
was such an
largest
efficient
species
killer
today,
that, unlike
typically
modern
weighs
piranhas
around
that hunt
10
in
kilograms.
schools, experts believe this ancient monster worked alone. Who needs backup when you can snap a femur by yourself? I guess that makes them slightly less terrifying since you would not face a swarm, but honestly, I am not volunteering to test that theory. So, that fish was clearly a nightmare. But imagine a scenario where it is not just one creature you have to worry about. Picture a pond where every single thing swimming in it is a tiny, horrifying monster. A place where being small and terrifying was not the exception, it was the law of the land. As it turns out, that era actually existed.
The Megapiranha's
For the
bite force
ultimate
peaked
collection
here,
of tiny
a power
terrors,
rivaled
you have
only
to
by
look
the
at the
largest
Cambrian
predators,
period.
like the
We
Sumatran
already know
tiger.
that the further back in history you go, the stranger life gets. Since this era unfolded 500 million years ago, the creatures here looked downright alien, largely thanks to a massive evolutionary event. The Cambrian explosion was a sudden burst of biological creativity. It caused life to branch out wildly, filling the fossil record with the ancestors of almost every major animal group we see today. Because they were the prototypes,
Using the jawbone
pretty much
schematic,
everything
we
alive back
analyzed
then
how super hard
looked
materials
primitive,
affect mastication
experimental,
efficiency
and
across
honestly,
regions A1
deeply
to A3.
disturbing. And to fit our theme, they were also surprisingly small. Believe it or not, the heavyweight champion of that entire era weighed only about 2 kilograms. That is roughly 4.4 pounds. Enter the Anomalocaris, a bizarre-looking arthropod that reigned as the world's first apex predator, using 2 strange, flexible arms to snatch up its victims. This little horror was just one part of a wider group called the radiodonts. They belong to an even bigger class known as dinocaridids, which included some absolutely freakish relatives. You had the Opabinia, with its weird trunk-like nozzle, and creatures like Caryocyntrips that wielded horizontal slicing arms. These appendages were lined with nasty spikes and rods, making them look like organic torture devices. Real talk, if I was wading in the ocean and felt one of those brush against my foot, my soul would leave my body. And the horror show did not stop there. You also had the Lobopodians, which I affectionately call the worms from hell, mostly because they look like something that would kill you in a gruesome fashion just by touching you. The poster children for this group were Hallucigenia and Ischia, both found in the famous Burgess Shale fossils in Canada. While those two definitely make you question reality, they might not even be the craziest ones. Take Collinsium, for example, a bristly monstrosity covered in spikes and tentacles that looks like it crawled out of a Stephen King novel. It is hard to believe something that nightmarish actually existed on this planet. Then you had relatives like Ovadia vermis, or Diania, which basically cosplayed as a walking, swimming cactus. If none of that freaks you out yet, let me introduce you to Phasa vermis. This thing had a body plan that looks suspiciously like the facehugger from the Alien movies. To be fair, it was less jump on your face and more root into the ground and wait for crumbs, but the resemblance is uncanny. I am just grateful there are 500 million years separating me from that thing. The list of horrors just keeps going, with creatures like Nectocaris and countless others. Like I said, this time period was basically an endless audition for sci-fi movie monsters. I have not even touched on the Morellomorphs yet, a group that looks like a trilobite having a really bad day. They were related to trilobites and probably ate similar food,
the class
but they were
I
infinitely
Morellomorpha,
creepier to
exemplified
look at.
by the
bottom
Morella
line is
species
this.
shown here,
While we tend to
displays
focus
a
on the
protective
giants,
head shell
these
curving
tiny
sharply.
ancient demons were just as scary. Sure, the massive beasts might be nightmare fuel, but honestly, it is the tiny, nasty critters that really mess with your head. Appreciate you hanging out, and I will catch you in the next one.